This is our presentation on the evaluation and prevention of unethical professional behavior by Kayla Senor, Jailie, Bullock, and Haley Livingston. First, we have part one, which is the case overview.
For the details, we decided to do our case about Ophelia Young, who was a licensed psychologist in New Hampshire. The client was a female juvenile who had an estranged relationship with her family, specifically with her father. Young broke ethical violations when she allowed her client to spend the night at her house on August 9th, 2013, when the client reported abuse.
There were many unethical decisions made in this case. First, we see that Dr. Young did not seek supervision or peer consultation while working outside of her competency. Though she acknowledged she had never worked this closely with a client before, she did not seek support in any way. We also know that Dr. Young had multiple relationships, and at one point she was providing therapy to both the client and the client's father. Dr. Young also created harm by not reporting the alleged abuse until 5 days after the client told her. Dr. Young was a mandated reporter, but again waited and caused harm in doing this. There's also a clear lack of boundaries in this case. As Haley mentioned, Dr. Young allowed the client to stay the night at her house. She also was driving her to tutoring sessions, to school. She had her over to her house for dinner multiple times, and many other things. There was also an inaccurate representation of fees in which Dr. Young charged the client's mother estate for things that were not related to therapy, such as pet supplies, shelter, food, and many more things. There were specific principles and standards that Dr. Young broke. First, she broke almost every general principle of the APA Code of Ethics, which are beneficence and non-maleficence, fidelity and responsibility, integrity, justice, and respect for people's rights and dignity. Dr. Young broke standard 1.06 of the APA Code of Ethics of cooperating with Ethics Committee. She broke this by not having any acknowledgement to the harm she caused to the client and lacked insight as to how she had broken the ethical code. Dr. Young also broke standard 2.01 boundaries of competency as discussed previously. She broke standard 2.02 of providing services in emergencies and standard 3.04 of avoiding harm, both in the situation where she did not report the alleged abuse until 5 days after the incident. Waiting this long to report the abuse made it so that the abuse can never be investigated by the police officers. Dr. Young also broke standard 3.04 of multiple relationships, as previously discussed, and standard 6.04 and standard 6.06, fees and financial arrangements, and accuracy in reports to others and funding sources, were both broken by the fact that Dr. Young charged the client's mother's estate for things other than therapy.
So the consequences, I've split them up in 3 different sections: professional, clients, and the organization itself. So for professional, what could happen, you could either be your job transferred, pay reduction, the loss of job, or loss of license. But in Dr. Young's case, it was a settlement agreement. So due to Dr. Young's actions, the settlement agent required Young to no longer treat patients under the age of 18. And also had to pay a $7,500 fine and complete 72 hours of continued education. And her license was suspended for a year. Then when the court got back together and re-looked at her case, it was suspended for another 10 months. Moving to the harm of the client and how this did affect her client, with all the allegations that her client did bring to Dr. Young, because she was the mandated reporter like Kayla's talking about, and she did not report this, that is just causing more harm to her client, where her father can continue to do these more harmful things to her, which is causing harm to Dr. Young's client. The organization, because Dr. Young does own her own private practice, it did shut down because she did lose her license, and it will continue to stay shut down until she gets her license back. So part 2, we are moving into the suggestions and also the benefits of seeking pure consultations and through the behaviors. confidentiality requirements can make it tough for therapists to seek support and guidance outside of work. Over time, this can contribute to loneliness and isolation, which can fuel to emotional distress. It also is peer consultation was introduced during the 1980s, and it was a nursing profession to foster adult learning and support for staff in the mental health area. And how to find peer consultations and the supervision is in two ways. The primary reasons for client supervision are to ensure, number one, the quality of client care, and number two, the clientele staff to continue professional development in a systematic and planned manner. In the substance abuse treatment, the clientele supervision is primary means of determining the quality care provided. And the Bible verse that I got from that is Proverbs 15:22, and that reads, "Without counsel, plans fail, but many adverse and they succeed." And then the standard that I chose for this is standard 2.01, boundaries of contempt.
Some steps to keep in mind when referring clients is to communicate with your client that you need to refer them, refer out of all or some care depending on the situation, explain that you are not abandoning the client, and get in-person support on how to refer the client. Tips one can follow when referring a client are 1, understanding and have training about the code of ethics, 2, reliable professionals, including their contact information and services. 3, familiarize yourself with signs and indicators of mental health issues that are out of your competency. 4, seek consultation with your mentor, coach, supervisor, or other helping professionals who have an in-depth understanding about referring clients. 5, create an emergency plan for clients when referring. 6, present the referral to the client in a positive way. Standard 2.01, which is the boundaries of competency. If one feels like their competency levels do not align, with standard 2.01, they may need to refer their client to a more competent professional. It is important to keep Proverbs 13:10 in mind when determining if a client needs to be referred. It states, "Where there is strife, there is pride, but wisdom is found in those who take advice." Tips that can be helpful when creating boundaries are the following. 1, limit self-disclosure. 2, establish rules. 3, do not treat friends or family. 4, do not engage in romantic or sexual relationships with clients. 5, avoid social media interactions with clients. 6, be cautious when it comes to touch. 7, refrain from giving and receiving gifts. 8, use rituals. 9, set clear boundaries. Overstepping boundaries with clients can cause potential harm, and this relates to standard 3.04. Deuteronomy 28:58-59 relates to how one should obey the ethical guidelines, and if they do not, there could be negative consequences.
Our next suggestion is for Dr. Young to refer to ethics code to make decisions. Dr. Young should have received academic courses on ethics and have a basic understanding of the code of ethics a psychologist should follow. Dr. Young should follow an acculturation model of understanding ethics that would allow her to understand the intersection of legal information and cultural information. To make better ethical decisions, she should find an ethical decision-making model to help her form the cognitive processes. Our textbook offers many different examples of these. Dr. Young should also form a commitment to a personal code of ethics that considers legal guidelines and her own personal values. Following models of ethical decision-making is good in theory, but the practical application does not have strong follow-through if not accompanied by a personal commitment. There are many different sources Dr. Young can use to create a personal code of ethics, including religious teachings, personal and familial values, and leaders who she admires who have strong ethics, as well as many other sources. Standard 1.06 of cooperating with the ethics committee and standard 3.04 of avoiding harm both relate to this suggestion. Our last suggestion is for Dr. Young to create resource connections. Having community resource connections may have prevented the situations that led to Dr. Young's actions. Community leaders are not usually connected to mental health systems, but research indicates that community leaders can be an essential part to treating mental illness. In this situation, Dr. Young having connections to community leaders and resources could have allowed for the client to have another resource to access her tutoring, so Dr. Young would be less inclined to break that boundary. Having community resources and connections also creates a safeguard against areas of ethical violations that are ambiguous in the counseling field. It could have been in this case that Dr. Young chose not to report the abuse allegations because she believed not reporting was in the best interest of the juvenile client. However, legally, this was not a decision for Dr. Young to make. A community connection may have allowed for reporting to be in the best interest of the client. In order to establish these community resource connections, Dr. Young should anticipate the community needs of her clients based on research of the demographics she is working with. She should then research the accessibility of these needed resources. From there, she should contact organizations who have these resources to establish professional connections for her to either refer clients to these organizations or refer these organizations to her clients. Standard 2.01, Boundaries of Competency, and Standard 3.04, Avoiding Harm, both relate to this suggestion. Hebrews 10:24 is a verse that also relates to this suggestion. It says, "And let us consider how we may spur one another toward love and good deeds." This verse highlights the need for community and using those around us to do our best in life. Now we're going to move on to our time of our own personal ethics.
People who have made an impact on developing my personal ethics are my parents, previous bosses, experience being a manager, professors, and friends. Examples of ethical choices I've made are when learning how to manage other employees and making sure they're following the guidelines. Unethical choices I've made are letting my managers take advantage of me and force me to make unethical decisions. 3 areas where I am susceptible to unethical behavior are 1, trying to please the client and others around me, 2, becoming too worried about the client, and 3, saying no when clients overstep boundaries. The most likely reasons I would fail are the following. 1, becoming too involved in the client's life to check on their well-being if I am especially concerned with them. 2, if a manager/supervisor instructed me to do something unethical, I might obey due to the fear of losing my job. And 3, I might accidentally let the client overstep boundaries to a certain degree because I have difficulty standing up for myself. A plan that would help me from making these failures are finding resources other than myself that could help the client's outside life if needed. If I felt like management was trying to make me make an unethical decision, I would talk to higher up management and or the board of psychology, and I would create rules for myself to help me if a client tried to overstep boundaries. The ethical decision-making model I chose was the Kuchar and Keith Spiegel, which is an 8-step model. And contemporary sources that support this model, Loletas, Francis, and Armistead et al., say that a thorough knowledge of ethical codes, which is necessary in preventing unethical behavior. And a Bible verse that relates to this is Isaiah 30:21, which states, "Whether you turn to the right or to the left, your ears will hear a voice behind you saying, 'This is the way, walk in it.'"
My ethic that I chose and the people that have helped me along the way are my grandparents, my parents, and my teammates. A big example that I've really thought about is definitely during my time at Johnson and being the FCA president. I've had to make a lot of tough decisions along the way. But the most difficult decision I'm actually currently in, and it is going to be who's going to take over FCA once I graduate and leave Johnson. This has also been very personal for me because I do have people that want to do it that I am close with. But I'm really having to take my personal beliefs and opinion out of it and really making more of the leadership role decision, and also being a lot more ethical about it, because if I make it personal, then that's not being the most ethical decision that I could make. A weakness that goes along with this is needing the approval of others and also overthinking everything. Needing the approvals of others is making sure that they could fit in the role well, but also making sure that they may like me if I do choose them or not. But that is also not going to an ethical decision if that is what I'm basing my decision based on. Then also spreading myself way too thin that could potentially cause burnout. Through the semester, that's something that I've really learned and worked on. And it's also still a weakness because I like to be involved with everything and help everyone out. I don't particularly know the word no, but that is something I've really had to been working on. My plan to help me with all this is focusing on what's really important and trying not to overextend myself and really minimizing the work effort that I do put in on certain things and being able to say no to people when I already do have plans. And I potentially may let somebody down, but I need to focus on myself to not get burnout. So those are my ethical decisions and how to avoid a non-ethical based decision. The model that I did choose is Kocher and Keith from 2006 because I believe that that is the best way of steps to help me with my ethical decisions.
For my ethical decisions, the first thing I look at is my personal values. Those include a commitment to doing no harm, having integrity, recognizing inherent human worth, continuously expanding my knowledge of the world around me. I've been influenced by a lot of people, especially people who choose to do the good and right thing, despite that also being the very, very hard thing. I have some names listed here of people in history who I think have done that well. Also, professors, spiritual leaders, and friends who have made hard ethical decisions but have done the right thing. I look to those examples and find encouragement in those people in my own community. I also look at my work with youth in which I've had to go through some hard ethical decision making. Some examples of ethical decisions I've made really relate back to my time with Johnson camp teams, both as a camp team leader and just as a camp counselor. As a camp team leader, I had to make a decision as to whether talk to my supervisor about some actions of a teammate. While these actions were not ill-intentioned at all, they were against the ethical guidelines set for us when we joined camp teams. And so making that decision was hard, especially because of the relationship at stake. I've also had some harder decisions to make that had a lot more ambiguity involving things campers had disclosed to me. I had to decide whether or not telling their local youth leaders would alleviate their emotional distress or cause more emotional distress. And so those were some gray areas where I really had to think through ethical decision making. Some areas I can see as susceptible to unethical behavior versus promoting welfare of client. And to me, that means the kind of complexity that comes when you want to do the very best thing for the client, and that could potentially mean explicitly breaking ethical guidelines or even laws. I think a lot of the example we had in this class of working for an organization that required you to report to the immigration department if somebody was here illegally. That's something I feel would really conflict with my personal values and I'd have a really hard time doing. Next would be boundaries, taking on secondary roles. Honestly, I could see myself making some of the decisions Dr. Young made in which I would want to do the greatest good by my client and attempt to take on secondary roles in that and working outside of the scope of therapy. And lastly, which I think combines the first two as well, is allowing my personal values to trump my professional values. I know that I care very deeply about the things I care about, and the things I care about are what guide me both personally and professionally. So I think I would really struggle in areas where my professional values would have to come above my personal values. In order to prevent from these areas of unethical behavior, the first thing I would do is have accountability through peer consultation. I would also have continuing education, both of the world of ethics and just the world of psychology as a whole. I would also practice consistent documentation. One source noted that having accurate and consistent documentation of work with clients is a way to have personal accountability to the decisions you're making. I would also avoid professional areas that might compromise my personal values. I would make sure that I'm not going to be in decisions that would compromise what I really, truly, deeply believe and what I really, truly, deeply care about. I would also want to have community connections to be less susceptible to breaking boundaries. in whatever role I'm working, I want to make sure I have resources to offer my clients so that when they do need things like transportation or food or somewhere to stay, I have a resource I can connect them with and be less tempted to take on that secondary role. The decision-making model I mostly relate to is the Fisher model found in our textbook. The verses that support all of my personal views of ethics, first is the story of Esther and her decision to do the right thing despite very real and very scary consequences. I think a lot of chapter 4, verse 14, which is many times summed up as maybe you were made for a time such as this. I also think of Job chapter 5, verses 15 through 16, which say, he saves the needy from the sword in their mouth. He saves them from the clutches of the powerful. So the poor have hope and injustice shuts its mouth. Lastly, the verse that I think guides all of my personal and professional life is Micah 6:8, which says, he has told you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God? Here are our references. This is the end of our presentation, and all of our references will be listed below. Thank you.